If this doesn't shock you, nothing will. The first time Rex slammed his shoulder into Nolan Ward's leg and forced him off the mountain trail, Nolan almost cursed at him. Almost. Because the German Shepherd had never done that without a reason. Nolan stumbled sideways on loose stone, boots scraping against shale, and caught himself against a pine trunk just as Rex planted himself broadside across the path again, chest heaving, ears high, eyes fixed not on the woods ahead, but on Nolan. That was wrong. Rex was a forward dog. A tracking dog. A threat detection dog. He barked at danger in front of him, not at Nolan.
"What are you doing?"
Nolan muttered. Rex answered with a sharp bark, then shoved him harder. 3 feet off the trail now. Wind moved through the ridge line in cold, dry breaths. Needles whispered overhead. Somewhere far below, water rushed unseen through the ravine. Otherwise, the mountain had gone strangely quiet. Too quiet. Nolan looked down the narrow trail cutting across the slope. Nothing obvious. Just dirt, roots, broken granite, and scrub pine clinging to the hillside. Early evening light bled gold through the trees, but the shadows had already begun to collect in the drop-offs. Rex growled. Not at the trail. At Nolan's boots. Then he bit the bottom edge of Nolan's cargo pants, not hard, but hard enough to make the message clear, and dragged him another step backward. That set a cold line down Nolan's spine. Rex had worked with him long enough to know the difference between command, suggestion, and panic. This wasn't excitement. This wasn't a false alert. This was the dog telling him, in the only language left, move right now. Nolan stepped back off the path. The moment he did, Rex spun toward the trail and barked once, into the stillness. Then the earth moved. It didn't happen like an explosion. It happened like a decision. A deep crack ripped through the slope ahead of him, loud and wrong and too close. The section of trail where Nolan had been standing less than 2 seconds earlier shuddered, dropped 6 inches, then tore away from the mountainside in a violent sheet of dirt, roots, and rock. The whole ledge collapsed into the ravine. A thunderous roar rolled down through the trees as stone slammed against stone below. Dust burst upward in a choking wave. Branches snapped. Loose shale bounced past them and vanished over the edge. Nolan stood frozen, chest locked, watching the trail disappear into open air. Rex shoved his nose hard into Nolan's hand. That brought him back. He dropped to one knee automatically, one hand gripping the dog's harness, the other braced against the ground as smaller stones kept sliding away. The mountain settled in ugly little jerks beneath them. Dust drifted through gold light. Somewhere below, one last boulder struck something hollow and boomed like distant artillery. Nolan's pulse was hammering so hard it made his vision narrow. He could still see exactly where his boot had been. If Rex had waited one more breath, Nolan shut the thought down before it finished. "Good dog," he whispered, and his voice came out rougher than he wanted. "Good dog." Rex didn't relax. The shepherd had turned again, body low, staring not at the collapse, but at the newly exposed wall of earth where the trail had ripped away. Nolan followed his line of sight. At first, he saw only broken roots and torn clay. Then something square caught the light. Not rock. Metal. Part of a rust-dark object had been uncovered inside the slope where the landslide had sheared the trail away. It looked like a box corner or maybe a panel, buried deep until the mountain itself had spit it out. Rex barked once. Nolan rose slowly, every nerve still live from the collapse. "You saw that too." The dog took 2 careful steps toward the broken edge, then stopped and whined low in his throat. That was new. Rex almost never whined on duty unless he smelled blood or heard something human. Nolan moved closer, staying well back from the unstable drop. He crouched and swept his eyes over the exposed section of hillside. More dirt sloughed away in small trickles. Roots hung loose in the air. And there, embedded in the torn earth like it had been hidden for years, was what looked unmistakably like part of a metal door. A hatch. Small. Rectangular. Military gray under the dirt. Nolan's mouth went dry. He hadn't served in 8 years, but some shapes never left your blood. Hinges. Reinforced corners. Bolt plate. Vent slits too precise to be random. Whatever this was, it was not old mining junk or backcountry trash. It had been installed. Rex's growl deepened. Again, not at the hatch. At the woods uphill. Nolan turned fast. Nothing. Only pines. Wind. The long evening shadows stretching thin and dark between trunks. Then came a sound. Faint. Metal clicking once against metal somewhere above them. Nolan went still. Not mountain noise. Not animal. Human-made. Rex pressed against his thigh and stared uphill so hard his whole body trembled. Someone else was on the ridge. Nolan dropped lower behind a boulder without thinking and tugged Rex down with him. Years out of uniform, and his body still moved before his mind when the world shifted toward threat. He listened past his own breathing, slow and careful now, forcing air into lungs that wanted to sprint. There. A branch creaked uphill. Then silence again. The kind of silence that meant the other person had heard something too and stopped to listen back. Nolan's jaw tightened. He had come to this mountain for quiet. That was the story he told people. The truth was uglier. He came because the world below had become too loud after Daniel Ruiz died under a roof Nolan told him was stable. Mission complete, village secured, one wrong judgment called during secondary search. Ruiz buried under stone, while Nolan clawed at rubble, until his fingernails tore, and his radio filled with commands to pull back. Ever since then, wrong sounds lived under everything. Cracking beams. Sliding dirt. Silence before collapse. Now the mountain had nearly killed him the exact same way, and Rex had stopped it. The dog nudged his hand again. Nolan looked down. Rex had shifted focus back to the exposed hatch. His ears flicked once toward the woods, then back to the metal. Like he was trying to tell Nolan both things mattered, but one mattered first.
What are you smelling?
Nolan whispered. Rex stepped out from behind the boulder, approached the broken edge, and stretched his neck toward the hatch. He sniffed once, twice, then jerked back sharply and barked, not in fear. In alarm. Nolan saw it then. A wire. Thin, nearly invisible, running from the hatch seam back into the dirt wall above it. His blood turned cold. Tripwire. Not old either. The line was too taut, too clean, too free of rust and root growth. Someone had either maintained it, or set it recently. Rex had not only saved him from the landslide. He had stopped him from moving closer to a booby-trapped hatch embedded in a mountain. Nolan's breathing slowed into something harder. This was no longer a bad trail and a lucky dog. This was a hidden installation. A trap. A watcher in the trees. And whatever lay behind that hatch had been protected well enough that somebody still cared if it stayed buried. The metallic click came again uphill. Closer. Rex spun and barked violently. A voice answered from the trees. Male. Calm. Much too calm.
You should have kept walking, Chief.
Nolan's body went cold from the inside out. Not because of the threat. Because of the title. Very few people out here knew he had retired as a Navy chief. He rose halfway behind the boulder and shouted, "Show yourself!" The wind moved through the pines. Then the voice came again, lower now, almost conversational.
I was hoping the dog would find it before the storm did.
Rex exploded into barking. Nolan's hand tightened on the pistol at his hip.
Who are you?
A figure stepped between the trees uphill. Tall. Dark jacket. cap pulled low. One hand visible, the other hidden. Not enough to identify, but enough for Nolan to see the scar across the man's jaw when the light caught it, and enough for the man to say the one thing that made the mountain feel suddenly much smaller.
"If that hatch opens,"
he said,
"you'll finally learn why Ruiz died."
Nolan forgot the cold. For one suspended second, the wind in the pines, the dust from the collapse, even Rex's violent barking all fell behind that single sentence. You'll finally learn why Ruiz died. Daniel Ruiz had been dead for 8 years. Officially, he died during a secondary structural failure after a weapons cache sweep in northern Syria. That was the report. That was the version Nolan had memorized because he had to. The version he heard in debriefings, investigations, therapy rooms, and sleepless nights where memory and guilt blended until he could no longer tell which details were real and which were punishment. Now a stranger stood on a mountain above a booby-trapped hatch and said Ruiz's name like he had been there. Nolan's voice came out lower than he expected.
"Nobody up here should know that name."
The man in the trees gave a humorless smile.
"Nobody down there was supposed to know it either."
Rex lunged toward him. Nolan caught the dog by the harness just before the shepherd launched past the boulder. Rex fought the restraint with a fury Nolan felt in both arms, barking into the trees so hard spittle flashed white in the fading light. The stranger didn't flinch. That mattered. Most men flinched when a trained German shepherd promised violence from 20 feet away. This one just adjusted his stance slightly, weight moving to the back leg, hidden hand still out of sight. Not civilian reflexes. Not random backcountry trespass or nerves. Trained.
"Take your hand out where I can see it,"
Nolan said. Slowly, the man obeyed. Empty. He stepped one pace farther into the open. Late 40s, maybe early 50s. Lean in the way men got after years of surviving too hard instead of living right. Dark stubble. Weathered face. Scar running from the corner of his jaw into the beard line. No obvious badge. No visible insignia. Just a dark field jacket and mountain boots dusted with the same shale that had nearly taken Nolan over the edge. Then Nolan saw the way the man's left arm moved. Guarded. He was injured. Rex's barking stopped as abruptly as it had started. The shepherd froze, ears forward, nose high, and gave one low sound deep in his throat. Not trust. Not exactly. But the alert had changed. He was scenting memory. The stranger saw that too.
"He remembers me,"
the man said quietly. Nolan's pulse sharpened.
"That's impossible." "Is it?"
Nolan kept the pistol up.
"Name."
The man looked past him toward the exposed hatch for half a second before answering.
"Aaron Vale."
Nothing in Nolan's memory moved. No mission brief. No deployment roll call. No after-action interview. Nothing. Aaron Vale saw it in his face and nodded once.
"That tracks." "What does that mean?" "It means they succeeded with you."
The mountain seemed to get quieter. Nolan's finger tightened along the trigger guard.
"You've got 5 seconds before I decide you're not worth listening to."
Vale's eyes shifted to the tripwire embedded in the exposed dirt wall.
"If I wanted you dead, Chief, I would have waited until the dog stopped arguing with you."
That was true. Nolan hated that it was true. Rex stepped forward again, this time not toward Vale, but toward the hatch, then immediately back toward Nolan, physically blocking him from taking even one careless step. The dog was trying to manage 2 threats at once, the man in the trees and the metal hidden in the slope. A rehook snapped through Nolan's mind then, one too ugly to ignore. Rex had smelled the landslide danger before the mountain moved. Rex had found the tripwire before Nolan saw it. And now Rex was treating this man not like a simple enemy, but like a problem connected to the hatch.
"What is this place?"
Nolan asked. Vale's mouth flattened.
"A burial."
Nolan's eyes cut to the hatch.
Burial for what?
Vale answered without hesitation.
For the truth.
Rex growled again. The evening light had started to thin fast now, turning the pines into dark vertical shapes against a bruised sky. Shadows deepened around the collapsed trail. The exposed hatch sat half buried in torn earth, like a wound the mountain regretted opening. Nolan forced himself to think in layers. 1. The stranger knew Ruiz. 2. The stranger knew his rank. 3. The stranger knew Rex. 4. The hatch was trapped. 5. Someone had either maintained that trap or returned recently enough to care. And the most dangerous layer of all, if Vale was lying, he was doing it with facts.
Start from the beginning,
Nolan said. Vale laughed once under his breath.
There is no beginning left. Just the part they bury deepest. That's not an answer. No.
Vale glanced up, listening, then back at Nolan.
It's a warning.
Rex barked sharply at the ridge behind Vale. Both men turned. Nothing visible. Just trees, wind, and the long gold line of evening dying at the far horizon. But Nolan heard it half a second later. A faint engine. Not close. Not loud. Far off and low, maybe on the old logging road beyond the next rise. One vehicle, maybe two. Hard to tell through the trees. Vale heard it too. His whole posture changed. Not fear. Urgency.
They found the slide faster than I hoped.
Nolan's pistol came up higher.
Who?
Vale looked at him for a long second that felt like judgment.
The people Ruiz died for.
That sentence landed harder than the first. Nolan stared at him.
Ruiz didn't die for anyone. He died because I made a bad call.
Vale's face went still.
That's what they told you.
Rex suddenly broke from Nolan's grip, not sprinting, not attacking, but cutting hard between both men and the hatch. He planted himself broadside over the narrow patch of stable earth, barking once at Vale, once at Nolan, then turning and staring into the exposed dirt seemed like he expected it to move. Nolan followed the dog's gaze. A tiny trickle of earth slid from above the tripwire anchor. Then another. Something inside the dirt wall had shifted. Vale saw it too and swore.
That wire's under tension now.
Nolan's muscles locked.
From what?
Vale didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. Whatever lay behind the hatch wasn't just wired to deter curiosity. The landslide had destabilized part of the system. One more pull of settling dirt, one wrong vibration, and the trap could go live on its own. The engine noise came again. Closer now. Rex barked more urgently, this time at Nolan. Move, the dog was saying. Decide. Nolan made a choice. He backed off the immediate edge and pulled Rex with him behind a rock outcrop 5 yards farther up the slope. Better angle. Better cover. Still line of sight on the hatch and Vale. Vale used the opening to move too, but not away. He approached the hatch from the left flank, careful, boots placing exactly where solid ground still held. Nolan almost shouted at him to stop, then noticed something that made him hold. Vale wasn't guessing. He was stepping around hidden markers only someone familiar with the site would know. He crouched by a scrub pine root, reached into wet dirt, and pulled up a thin section of camouflaged cord Nolan had never seen. The cord led not to the hatch, but to a secondary anchor buried uphill. A dead man's stabilization line. Nolan's mind sharpened.
You've been here before.
Vale gave him a brief look.
Many times.
Then he drew a folding blade, cut the secondary cord, and the tripwire at the hatch immediately loosened by half an inch. Relief flickered through Rex first. The dog's growl dropped in tone. So Vale wasn't bluffing about understanding the trap. But that only made the next question uglier.
Why keep it buried?
Nolan asked. Vale stood slowly.
Because there are things inside men build walls around for a reason. Nolan thought of the name Ruiz, of years of blame, of waking in sweat, because part of him still heard the roof coming down. "What's in the hatch?" he asked. Vale met his eyes. "Proof that your team never walked into that village by accident." The words cut through Nolan like cold metal. No filler. No explanation. Just a line dropped with enough weight to rearrange everything behind it. Nolan took one step forward before Rex blocked him again. This time the dog looked up at Nolan, not the hatch, not Vale. Straight at Nolan. Ears back. Breathing hard. Protective. He didn't want Nolan closer. Not yet. The engine had become two engines now. Definitely two vehicles. Somewhere above the ridge, maybe less than a mile out. Vale heard it, and closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, like a clock had just run out. "They're coming from the North Road. They'll be here in under 8 minutes. Then talk fast." Vale pulled a small object from inside his jacket and tossed it to Nolan. Instinct caught it before thought could object. Dog tags. Old U.S. military issue. Mud-stained. Weathered. Real. Nolan wiped one with his thumb under the dying light. Ruiz Daniel M. His throat closed. Ruiz's tags had been logged with the casualty file. Nolan remembered the paperwork. He remembered the sealed bag. He remembered signing the chain of custody line, because no one else from the unit could make their hand steady enough. He turned the second tag. No name. Just coordinates scratched into the back by hand. Coordinates. Not a prayer. Not a keepsake. A location. This location. Nolan lifted his head slowly. "How the hell do you have these?" Vale's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Because Ruiz handed them to me himself." The mountain went silent again. Not normal silence. The kind that comes right before reality breaks open and refuses to be put back the way it was. Nolan heard his own breathing. Heard Rex's collar tags click softly as the shepherd shifted weight. Heard the distant engines rising through the trees like something inevitable. But underneath all of it, one sentence kept echoing. Ruiz handed them to me himself. Nolan wanted to call it a lie. Wanted to reject it on instinct. Wanted to put a bullet into the dirt 6 inches from Vale's boot and demand a better story. Instead, because some part of him already knew this night had crossed out of normal life, he asked the only question that mattered. "When?" Vale's eyes went to the hatch. "The night he was supposed to die." And before Nolan could ask anything else, the metal under the exposed dirt gave a sudden internal thud from the inside. The thud from inside the buried hatch hit Nolan harder than Vale's words had. Not because it was louder. Because it was impossible. Rex sprang backward from the exposed metal door with a violent bark, then shoved himself into Nolan's leg again, forcing him 2 steps off the unstable edge. The shepherd's hackles stood high, ears pinned, every line of his body screaming the same warning in a different form. Do not go closer. Nolan obeyed the dog before he obeyed his own instincts. He backed off the torn slope and brought the pistol up toward the hatch, breath slow, shoulders tight, heart kicking hard enough to hurt. Vale didn't move immediately. He stared at the metal with the face of a man watching an old nightmare wake up. "That shouldn't happen," Vale said. Nolan's eyes cut to him. "You said you knew this place." "I do." "Then what was that?" Vale's jaw tightened. "An internal latch." The mountain seemed to hold its breath around them. Wind hissed through the pines. Dust from the collapsed trail drifted down the raw dirt wall in thin ribbons. Below, the ravine still clicked and shifted as loose stone settled. Above, the sound of approaching engines rolled closer through the trees. Rex barked sharply uphill, then back at the hatch. Both threats. Both now. Nolan felt choice tightening around him like wire. Unknown armed teams coming from the North Road. hidden military hatch embedded in a mountain. Dog tags from a dead teammate now in his hand. And somewhere inside that metal door, something had just moved or unlocked on its own. The hatch gave another sound. A scrape this time. Metal dragging against metal from the inside. Rex growled low and stepped in front of Nolan. Vale moved then, careful, controlled, taking the same left flank approach he'd used before. Nolan almost stopped him, but Rex didn't lunge this time. The dog watched Vale with fierce suspicion, not attack. That was enough for Nolan to hold. Vale knelt beside the hatch seam and pressed 2 fingers to the steel. "Cold," he muttered. "What does that tell you?" "That the chamber's still venting." Nolan frowned. "Still?" Vale looked up at him, rain-dark eyes hard in the dying light. "Chief, this wasn't a cache. It was a holding site." The words landed ugly. Nolan looked at the hatch again. The vent slits. The reinforced frame. The hidden tripwire. The coordinates scratched behind Ruiz's tag. Every piece suddenly leaned toward a truth he did not want. "For people?" he asked. Vale didn't answer. That was answer enough. Another internal click sounded from beneath the steel. This time the left edge of the hatch shifted outward by less than an inch, as if a pressure seal had just released. Stale air breathed out of the mountain. Rex barked and backed away. The smell hit Nolan a second later. Cold concrete. Damp metal. Old electrical burn. Antiseptic. And under it, unmistakable even after years in the ground, blood. Not fresh. Not strong. But real. Nolan's mouth went dry. "Open it," Vale said. Nolan stared at him. "You just told me it's a holding site. And in 4 minutes, maybe less, the people coming up that road will seal whatever's left in there." "Who are they?" Vale looked uphill toward the engines, then back at Nolan. "The same people who rewrote your mission report." Rex barked again, violent now. The shepherd had turned away from both men and was staring into the trees above the ridge line, nose high. Nolan heard it this time too, a new sound layered over the engines. Rotor buzz. Small. Fast. A drone. Vale heard it and swore under his breath. "They're ahead of schedule." Nolan holstered the pistol, grabbed the exposed edge of the hatch, and looked at Rex once. "Stay on me." The dog did not like it, but he stayed. Together Nolan and Vale hauled the metal door the rest of the way open. It fought them like something old and unwilling, then gave with a tearing groan that echoed down into the mountain. A square shaft opened beneath. Ladder rungs descended into a concrete chamber maybe 12 feet down. Red emergency light pulsed weakly below, still alive off some buried backup circuit. On the far wall Nolan could make out a steel chair bolted to the floor, restraints hanging from one arm. A table. Cabinets. A drain in the center of the concrete. No bodies. That almost made it worse. Rex whined once at the opening, then barked sharply into the shaft. The red light pulsed again. This time Nolan saw something else on the table below. A sealed evidence pouch. And beside it, a tape recorder. His chest tightened. Vale dropped to one knee and leaned into the opening. "Damn. You knew it was still active?" "I knew they buried it fast. I didn't know they left anything behind." The rotor buzz overhead grew louder for a second, then drifted off to the right as if the drone were sweeping the ridge in a widening search pattern. Nolan put one boot on the first ladder rung. Rex blocked him instantly. The dog hit Nolan's thigh hard enough to throw him off balance, then barked down into the shaft and snapped at the air above the opening, frantic, furious, warning. Vale's head whipped upward. "Thermal." Nolan froze. There, tucked just inside the hatch frame where dirt had still hidden most of the metal, sat a small sensor dome no bigger than a coin, its casing cracked by the landslide but not dead. A tiny amber light glowed inside. Not a motion detector. Warmer than that. Smarter. Opening the hatch woke the beacon, Vale said. Nolan's pulse surged. To who? Vale almost laughed. To everybody who still matters to this place. Rex barked uphill again. Voices now. Faint, but real. Men moving through the trees above the ridge, spreading out. Nolan could hear the discipline in the spacing, the lack of wasted noise. Professionals. Not search and rescue. Not hikers. Not local deputies. Vale made his choice in a second. He reached into the shaft, grabbed the evidence pouch and recorder off the table, and threw them up onto the dirt beside Nolan. Take those. Nolan did, reflex first. The pouch was marked with black block lettering, faded but legible. Operation Glass Veil/Site 4. Inside sat a folded paper file and a blood-stained patch from a U.S. uniform sleeve. Nolan turned the patch under the red light. Unit insignia. His unit. From the mission where Ruiz died. The world narrowed. Vale was already reaching back into the shaft. There should be a secondary drawer under the table. Nolan dropped down 2 rungs despite Rex's furious protest, and swept the chamber with his eyes. The steel chair. The restraints. The cabinets half open. On the far wall, scratched so hard into the paint it cut to the metal beneath, one word. Liar. Nolan stopped breathing for a second. Ruiz's handwriting. He knew it instantly. Ruiz always drove the R too far forward and scored the last line too deep when he wrote angry. Vale saw it too, and his face changed. He was here longer than I thought. Was? Vale looked at him sharply. Nolan. Not Chief now. Nolan. Too personal to be good. Before Nolan could press him, Rex erupted into savage barking at the ridge above them. A beam of white light snapped through the trees and struck the torn trail edge. Another beam answered from farther left. Then a voice, amplified and cold, rolled down the slope. Step away from the opening and place your hands where we can see them. Nolan came out of the shaft fast, clutching the pouch and recorder. 3 laser dots walked across the dirt near his boots. One settled on Vale's chest. Rex moved in front of both men. Vale's breathing turned shallow. They brought a full recovery cell. Nolan kept low behind the rock, thinking fast. How many? At least 6 if they're talking that loud. The amplified voice returned. This site is under federal containment authority. You are in possession of restricted national security material. Rex barked into the lights. Then something new started beneath Nolan's hand. The tape recorder. It clicked alive on its own. Static hissed through the tiny speaker. Nolan stared at it. The old machine had no visible power switch on. No batteries should have survived years underground. Static crackled once more. Then a voice came through. Weak. Hoarse. Unmistakable. Nolan, if Rex found this before I got back. Ruiz. Alive and sound if nowhere else. Nolan's whole body locked. Ruiz's recorded voice dragged through static and pain. Don't let them move me again. Don't let Vale. The recording cut off in a burst of distortion. At that exact moment, Vale lunged for the recorder. Vale moved first. The moment Ruiz's voice broke through the static and cut off on his own name, Aaron Vale lunged for the recorder like a starving man reaching for the only thing left that could still kill him. Nolan caught his wrist before his fingers touched the device. The 2 men slammed shoulder first into the dirt beside the open hatch, sliding in loose shale while laser dots jittered over rock and mud around them. Rex exploded into barking, circling hard, torn between defending Nolan from the men in the trees and defending Nolan from Vale himself. Get off it. Vale hissed. Nolan drove an elbow into his ribs. Why? Because that was the question now. Not who the lights belonged to. Not whether the men above were real. Not even whether Ruiz had truly survived the mission long enough to leave a message. Why had Vale panicked at the sound of Ruiz trying to say his name? A shot cracked past them and struck the rock beside the hatch, showering both men with stone splinters. The amplified voice rolled down again, colder this time. Last warning. Step away from the container.
Rex put himself between the ridge lights and Nolan's body, barking with a violence that made the whole slope feel smaller. Vale stopped fighting for half a second, listening to the dog. Then he said, through clenched teeth,
"If they hear the rest of that tape, we all die faster."
Nolan grabbed the recorder first. He ripped it against his chest and rolled clear, just as two more suppressed rounds punched into the dirt where he had been. Vale scrambled behind the boulder with him, breathing hard now, the scar along his jaw standing pale under the strobing red light from the hatch. Rex backed into Nolan's leg and growled uphill. The tape recorder clicked again. Static. A pop. Then Ruiz's voice returned. Fainter now. More broken. But still unmistakably Ruiz.
"Don't let Vale tell you he was trying to save us."
Nolan's blood turned cold. Vale shut his eyes once. That was enough. Nolan stared at him.
"What did you do?"
Vale shook his head.
"Not now."
The lights above shifted. Men were moving downhill in a spread, closing distance under cover, while the amplified voice kept them pinned with procedure language. Nolan could hear boots on loose gravel now, careful and synchronized. Professionals. At least 4 in front, maybe 2 holding higher angle. The rotor buzz of the drone passed once overhead, then peeled away toward the ravine like it was widening a perimeter. Ruiz's voice crackled on.
"They'll say the cash mattered. It didn't."
"The people did?" The recorder hissed, skipped, resumed.
"I tried to move the girl first. Nolan, if you're hearing this."
The tape snagged in static so violently it almost tore the sentence apart. The girl. Nolan felt the words hit like a body blow. Vale's face had changed. Not panic now. Shame. Real, raw, impossible to hide shame. Nolan's voice dropped.
"What girl?"
Vale didn't answer. Nolan grabbed his jacket and shoved him hard into the rock.
"What girl?"
Before Vale could speak, one of the lights broke left and a man rushed the lower angle. Rex saw him first. The shepherd launched downhill like a black weapon, hitting the operator at the knee before Nolan's eyes fully tracked the motion. The man went down with a scream, rifle firing wild into the air. Nolan came up from behind the boulder and put one round into the dirt 6 inches from the second advancing light.
"Back off!"
They didn't, which told him all he needed. This was not retrieval with arrest priorities. This was recovery with elimination flexibility. Vale grabbed Nolan's sleeve and yanked him down an instant before a round tore through the branch above his head.
"You keep posting up like that, and they'll pit us in 30 seconds.
Nolan shoved him off.
"Then give me a reason not to leave you here."
Vale looked at the recorder in Nolan's hand. Ruiz's voice came through again, weaker, like he was recording while fading in and out.
"If Chief blames himself, let him. That keeps him alive. But if he ever finds Site 4, tell him the convoy wasn't hit by chance. Tell him."
Static drowned the next words. Nolan felt his chest lock. Chief blames himself. Let him. His whole life since that mission seemed to tilt on that sentence. Therapy. Anger. The exact shape of grief he had built himself around. Was it all selected for him? Maintained? Fed because guilt kept him manageable? The tape clicked dead. Battery gone. Or message ended? Hard to know. Rex came back up the slope limping slightly, blood on his muzzle that wasn't his own. He planted himself beside Nolan again, chest pumping, ears locked on the dark. Vale looked at the dog with an expression Nolan couldn't read.
"He always did choose the right person too late." What does that mean? Vale exhaled hard. It means Ruiz trusted me first. A shot struck the safe metal buried in the slope below with a deep ringing clang. Another hit the exposed hatch frame. The men on the ridge were no longer trying to scare them off. They were trying to collapse options. Nolan risked one glance downhill. The torn trail edge was too unstable to descend fast. The ridge above was closing. The ravine to the left was steep enough to break an ankle in twilight. That left one path. The hatch. He looked at Vale. How deep does Site 4 run? Vale understood immediately, and his face tightened. Too deep if they flood it. They will? They'll do worse. Rex barked sharply at the hatch. The dog had turned away from the ridge again and was staring straight into the shaft, hackles high, not in fear this time, but urgency. Something below mattered to him. Strong enough to pull focus from armed men above. Nolan saw it a beat later. Light. Not the red emergency pulse. A different light, moving once deep in the chamber beyond the visible room, then disappearing. He went cold. Vale saw it too and whispered, "No, what? There shouldn't be anyone left down there." Rex barked again and stepped toward the opening. Nolan caught his harness. "Stay close." The amplified voice from above changed tone. No longer procedural. Personal now. "Chief Ward," it called. "You are about to endanger classified detainee material. If you enter that site, you void all federal protections." Nolan almost laughed. Protections. That word meant nothing on a mountain, with laser dots walking his chest, and dead men talking from tape recorders. Vale leaned close. "That voice is Mercer." "Who?" "Deputy Recovery Chief. Ex-Ranger. Doesn't bluff when he can just bury the problem." Nolan's hand tightened on the pistol. The moving light flickered again below the shaft, this time accompanied by a sound. Not machinery. Not settling earth. A cough. Small. Human. Close enough to echo. Rex tore free from Nolan's grip and jumped onto the first ladder rung before Nolan could stop him. The shepherd did not descend, but he stretched his head into the shaft and barked down, high and urgent, the way he barked when he found a trapped hiker in Colorado 2 years earlier. A survivor bark. Nolan's whole body changed. There are sounds a soldier never stops obeying. That bark was one of them. He turned to Vale. "You said this was a burial." Vale's answer came too slowly. "Sometimes," he said, "they bury people breathing." The slope seemed to lurch under Nolan's feet. The girl, he thought. Ruiz tried to move the girl first. And whatever had just coughed below them might not be a memory, or a message, or a ghost of an old black site. It might be the reason Ruiz died. Mercer's voice came from the ridge again, sharpened now by loss of patience. "This is your final command to step away." Nolan made the choice. He shoved the evidence pouch inside his jacket, jammed the recorder into a cargo pocket, and swung one leg onto the ladder. Vale grabbed his arm. "If there's someone alive down there, opening the inner chamber will trip the lower alarm. If—" Vale held his gaze. "If it hasn't already." Rex barked from below. Another cough rose from the darkness. Weaker. Desperate. Nolan ripped free. "Then we move before they do." He descended fast, boots hitting steel rungs, red emergency light strobing up his legs. Rex dropped below him into the first chamber, and spun toward the back wall, where a second steel door stood half-concealed behind a row of medical cabinets. A keypad beside it blinked amber. Occupied. Vale came down after him, muttering curses under his breath. Above them, boots hit the dirt around the hatch. Mercer's voice echoed into the shaft. "Do not breach the secondary door." Nolan drew Ruiz's tags from his pocket and stared at the coordinates scratched on the back. Not coordinates, he realized suddenly. A number pattern. 4, 1, 7, 9. He looked at the keypad. 4 digits. Vale saw it too, and his face drained of color. Ruiz left you the code. Nolan keyed it in. The amber light turned green. For one single breath, nobody moved. Then the second door unlocked with a hard internal clunk. Mercer shouted from above. Vale stepped back like the opening itself might explode. Rex planted himself directly in front of the door, barking at the seam. Nolan pulled it open. Cold air rolled out first. Then dim emergency light. Then the shape of a small room with a cot, restraints, a water bucket, and a wall covered in tally marks cut into concrete over years. And on the cot, blinking in the sudden light, one hand flying up to shield her face, sat a woman no older than 25 clutching an old military blanket around her shoulders. She looked at Nolan once, then at the dog, and began to cry before he could speak. Because around her neck, hanging on a frayed cord above a torn field shirt, was Daniel Ruiz's wedding ring. For one suspended second, nobody in the chamber moved. Not Nolan. Not Vale. Not even Rex. The red emergency light pulsed across the small room, turning the concrete walls dark and wet-looking, and the woman on the cot stared back at them with a kind of terror that only belongs to people who have been opened out of a cage too many times. One hand was still up against the light. The other clutched the old military blanket so hard her knuckles had gone white. But her eyes were not on Nolan. They were on Rex. The German shepherd had stopped barking. He stood in the doorway of the secondary room, body rigid, ears high, nose working in short fast pulls. Then, slowly, so slowly it almost hurt to watch, Rex stepped forward and made a low sound in his throat Nolan had only heard a few times in 8 years. Recognition. The woman broke. Not into screaming. Not panic. Into tears. "They sent the dog," she whispered. Nolan felt the sentence land in his chest like a hand. Behind him, Vale swore softly under his breath. Above them, Booth scraped around the open hatch. Mercer's voice barked orders into the shaft, clipped and controlled, but now it sounded farther away, not because the men had retreated, but because Nolan's whole world had narrowed to the room in front of him, the wedding ring on a cord around the woman's neck, and the fact that Rex was treating her like she mattered. Nolan crouched slightly, pistol still up but lowered from center mass. "Who are you?" The woman swallowed hard. Her lips trembled before she forced them steady. "He told me if anyone ever came with the dog, it would be you." Nolan's pulse kicked. "He who?" Her fingers rose to the ring at her throat. "Daniel Ruiz. Not last name. Not rank. Daniel." That was intimate enough to hurt. Vale stepped into the room behind Nolan, and the instant the woman saw him, everything changed. She recoiled so hard she hit the wall behind the cot, blanket tightening to her chest. "No," she whispered. "No, not him." Rex spun and put himself between Vale and the cot. Nolan caught that too. Not random fear. Not confusion. A reaction. "Back up," Nolan said without turning. Vale stopped immediately. "Chief, listen to me, back up." Something in Nolan's tone finally got through. Vale took one step back into the threshold, hands open, but the damage was done. The woman's breathing had turned ragged. She looked at Vale the way trapped people look at doors that have opened for the wrong reason. Nolan turned slightly. "You know her?" Vale's silence answered before his face did. "Not well," he said. The woman gave a short broken laugh. "That's a lie." Above them, Mercer shouted again. A metallic clank followed. They were bringing something down into the shaft. Cutting tools maybe. Breech gear. Nolan didn't have long. He lowered the pistol another inch and looked back at the woman. "Name." She hesitated. Then, Mara.
No last name. Nolan accepted that for now.
How do you have Ruiz's ring?
Mara touched it once, not like jewelry, but like proof she was still allowed to hold one thing that belonged to the outside world.
Because he thought you wouldn't believe me without it.
Nolan's throat tightened.
Believe what?
Rex took another step toward the cot and gently rested his chin on the edge. Mara looked down at him, and for the first time since the door opened, some of the terror in her face loosened. She threaded trembling fingers into the fur behind his ear.
He brought the dog once,
she said quietly.
Before they moved me. Not for long. Just enough to prove he meant what he promised.
Nolan stared.
Ruiz brought Rex here?
Rex answered with a soft whine. That was all Nolan needed. The dog remembered. Memory hit him in ugly fragments then. One deployment rotation before the mission went bad, Ruiz laughing while Rex refused to obey anyone except Nolan and occasionally, when bribed with enough dried meat, Ruiz. The dog had always liked him. Trusted him. If Ruiz had come here with Rex, that meant Nolan's teammate had been inside this place before the
accident.
Before the collapse. Before the lie he'd been living inside for 8 years. Vale saw Nolan putting it together and said quickly,
It wasn't supposed to go that far.
Nolan turned on him.
What wasn't?
Vale opened his mouth. Mara answered first.
The transfer.
The word dropped into the room like a weight. Nolan looked back at her.
What transfer?
She swallowed once, eyes flicking to the door, to Vale, to the ceiling where the muffled sounds of men working closer drifted down in harsh metallic rhythms.
Site 4 wasn't a prison,
she said.
Not exactly. It was a handoff point.
Nolan waited. Mara's gaze shifted to the tally marks cut into the far wall. Hundreds of them. Some deep. Some faint. Some grouped in fives. Some not.
For people they wanted moved without records.
Every muscle in Nolan's body tightened.
People like you?
Mara looked at him, then gave the smallest shake of her head.
People like me.
Witnesses.
Children. Informants. Interpreters. Sometimes soldiers who had seen the wrong thing and lived too long after.
Rex's growl returned, not at her. At the room itself, as if the concrete had started smelling worse the longer the truth stayed in the air. Nolan felt his own breathing change. Not fear. Something colder.
And Ruiz?
Mara's eyes filled again, but this time she held them steady.
He was supposed to deliver us.
Us. Plural. Nolan heard that instantly.
Us?
Mara closed her hand around the ring.
There were 3 of us when he got here.
Behind Nolan, Vale shifted his weight. That tiny motion was enough. Nolan spun.
Don't move.
Vale froze again, but now the shame on his face had curdled into something more defensive, more desperate.
Chief, if Mercer gets through that hatch before we move, how many people were in your convoy?
Nolan cut in. Vale looked away. Wrong move. Nolan took one step toward him.
How many?
6 detainees, Vale said at last.
2 handlers. Ruiz and Neon escort support.
The chamber seemed to shrink. Mara spoke softly.
By morning, there were 2 left breathing.
No one said anything after that, because there was no way to make a sentence like that smaller. Above them, steel screamed against steel. The outer hatch was being widened. Mercer's men were no longer waiting for surrender. They were coming in. Nolan forced himself back into the moment.
Mara, Ruiz tried to move you first.
Her expression changed. Not surprise. Pain.
He tried to move the child first,
she said.
I stopped him.
Nolan stared.
Why would you stop him? Because she wouldn't leave without me.
The word she hit him with next was almost gentle.
My sister?
The room went very still. Nolan thought of Ruiz's recording.
I tried to move the girl first. Girl. Not woman. Not witness. Girl. How old? He asked. Mara's voice went thin. 9. Rex barked suddenly toward the back wall. Once. Then again, sharper. Nolan turned. The far wall behind the tally marks looked solid at first glance, but once the light hit it from the right angle, he saw it. A seam. Vertical. Narrow. Another hidden panel set into the concrete. Mara saw where he was looking and went pale. No! Nolan stepped toward it. What's behind that? She slid off the cot too fast, nearly falling. Don't! Rex was already there, paws on the wall, barking in urgent short bursts. Not threat alert. Find alert. The same bark he used when he located trapped hikers or wounded men under debris. Nolan's blood turned to ice. Mara, he said, and now there was nothing gentle left in his voice. What is behind that wall? She looked at the seam, then at the ring, then at Nolan. When she answered, the words came apart as they left her. The second room. Vale's face changed instantly. No! Nolan turned on him. You knew. Vale took one step backward. Chief, whatever is in there is why Mercer came in person. That was worse than a denial. Nolan crossed to the wall and ran his hand over the seam. Cold steel under paint. Same concealment pattern as the door they had just opened. He found a recessed latch plate set waist high. Locked. Mara was shaking now. Daniel said if the site was ever compromised, you were supposed to take the ring and leave the second room closed. Nolan looked over his shoulder. Why? This time, when she answered, her eyes went to Rex. Because the dog was still barking at the wall, as if something on the other side could hear him. Because if she was still alive, Mara whispered, opening it would tell the whole mountain. Nolan's pulse slammed once, hard. She. Not memory. Not body. Not evidence. A person. Alive, maybe. After 8 years. Mercer's voice echoed down the shaft then, louder than before, almost triumphant. Secondary breach point confirmed. Vale moved fast, too fast. He lunged not for Nolan this time, but for the back wall, one hand diving toward the latch plate like he meant to open it himself or destroy it before Nolan could. Nolan hit him hard and drove him sideways into the steel chair. The restraints clanged against the frame. Rex wheeled from the wall and snarled in Vale's face. Mara cried out. Above them, boots hit the ladder. Mercer's men were entering Site 4. And beneath Nolan's hand, where his body had slammed Vale into the hidden panel, something clicked. The second room had unlocked itself. The hidden panel didn't swing open all at once. It released with a hard internal clunk, then drifted inward 3 inches under its own weight as if pressure from the other side had been waiting years for permission to escape. Cold air slid out of the gap, cleaner than the chamber air, sharper, carrying the smell of oxygen tubing, antiseptic, and something old and human that had been sealed away too long. Rex exploded into barking. Not his threat bark this time. A fine bark. Nolan grabbed the panel and hauled it wider. The second room beyond was smaller than Mara's holding cell but colder, brighter, and more clinical. Battery strips still glowed a sickly white along the floor. A narrow cot stood against the far wall under a hanging bag gone half yellow with age. There was a heart monitor on standby, old but powered. Cabinets. A sink. Restraints. A drain. And on the cot sat a girl. Not a child anymore. 17, maybe 18. Thin to the point of fragility. Dark hair cut unevenly at the jaw. Bare feet tucked up under a gray blanket. One wrist still cuffed to the bed frame, the skin beneath it scarred and pale. She blinked against the sudden opening of the door, like the light physically hurt her.
Mara made a sound Nolan never wanted to hear from another human being. Not surprise. Recognition breaking under years of dread. "Lena," she whispered. The girl looked up. For a second, she seemed not to understand what she was seeing. Her eyes moved from Mara to Nolan to the open doorway, and then, finally, to Rex. Everything changed in her face. Not relief exactly. Memory. Rex stopped barking and crossed the room in 2 careful steps. His body stayed low, submissive almost, like he knew sudden motion could break something inside her. He rested his muzzle on the edge of the cot. Lena reached out with shaking fingers and touched the fur between his ears. Then she started crying soundlessly. Above them, Mercer's men hit the lower shaft ladder. The metal rang through the site like a countdown. Vale moved first. He slammed the main secondary room door half shut and dragged the steel chair across the threshold, jamming one leg into the frame. It wouldn't stop a breach team. It might give them 5 seconds. 10 if Luck still lived anywhere near this mountain. Nolan looked from the girl on the bed to Vale. "You said 1 room?" Vale didn't turn. "I said enough to get you down here." "That's not good enough." "No," Vale snapped, finally turning. "It isn't." Mara was already at the cot, working frantically at the cuff around Lena's wrist with fingers that would not stop shaking. "Key," she said. "Where's the key?" Vale reached into his jacket and tossed her a small brass tool. "Lower cabinet lockbox." Mara caught it one-handed. The steel chair at the outer doorway shuddered under the first impact from Mercer's team. A man's voice echoed through the chamber. "Aaron! Step clear!" Mercer. Calm. Close. Too close. Rex spun and growled at the door. Nolan crossed to Mara and looked at Lena for the first time up close. She was younger than the room had first made her seem. Trauma had carved years into her face, but the structure beneath it was still almost girlish. There were faded injection bruises along the inside of one elbow, a healed split on the lip, a line of tiny notched scars cut into the cuff side bed rail. Days? Weeks? A count of something survived. She flinched when Nolan's shadow fell across her, then forced herself to hold still. "It's okay," he said, though nothing about any of this was okay. "We're getting you out." Lena looked at the ring on Mara's neck, then back at Nolan. Her voice came out paper-thin. "He came back with the dog." Nolan's throat tightened. "Ruiz?" Lena nodded once. Mercer hit the outer door again. The chair screeched backward 2 inches. Vale swore and braced his shoulder into it. "Nolan!" Nolan turned. Vale's face had gone ashen with urgency. "There's a maintenance run behind the oxygen wall. Crawl tunnel. Tight, wet, ugly. But it leads to a drainage cut west of the ridge. Why didn't you say that first?" "Because I didn't know if you walk out of here with her or with the evidence." That landed because it was true. For 1 ugly second earlier, Nolan might have chosen the recorder, the tags, the proof. Now there was a living girl with a cuff on her wrist, and Ruiz's dog recognizing her like unfinished duty. That choice was gone. Mara got the lockbox open, seized the cuff key, and jammed it into the restraint. Lena kept her eyes on Nolan. "Is Daniel dead?" The question cut harder than Mercer's men ever could. Nolan didn't have time to answer gently. "Yes." Lena closed her eyes. Only for a second. Then she nodded once, almost like she had expected that answer for years, and had finally run out of reasons to pretend otherwise. The cuff snapped open. Mercer's voice came again through the door, colder now. "You do not want to make me breach with flash and gas. The witness is more valuable alive than undamaged." Witness. Not detainee. Not asset. Witness. Nolan caught that instantly. He looked at Lena. "Witness to what?" Mara answered before Lena could. "To your mission.
The room went silent for half a heartbeat. Then the door burst inward. Not all the way. Just enough for a flashbang to bounce through the gap and skid spinning across the concrete toward the cot. Rex saw it first. The dog lunged, hit the metal canister with one paw, and knocked it under the sink just before it detonated. The blast still slammed the room with white light and concussive force, but the sink frame ate most of the worst of it. Nolan ducked, ears ringing. Mara threw herself over Lena. Vale lost his footing at the doorway. Rex shook his head hard once, already recovering. Then Mercer's team came in. 2 men low. One high with a shield. Mercer himself behind them, pistol drawn, face expressionless under a wet tactical hood. Nolan fired from the side angle before the shield man fully cleared the frame. The round punched the corner of the shield and spun the lead operator sideways. Rex hit the second man at knee height and drove him into the cabinets. Mara dragged Lena off the cot. Vale tackled the half-fallen steel chair into the breach, turning the doorway into a knot of bodies and shouting. The room became all motion. Gunfire punched white sparks from concrete. Glass shattered. The hard monitor toppled and screamed one flat electronic tone before dying. Mercer didn't rush. That made him worse. He stepped through chaos with the patience of a man who believed outcome already belonged to him. When his eyes found Lena, something like satisfaction flickered across his face. "There you are," he said. Nolan fired at him. Mercer had already moved. The round tore through the floor stand instead. "Take her through the wall," Vale shouted. Mara found the oxygen panel release and ripped it open. Behind it yawned exactly what Vale promised. A narrow service crawl black with runoff water and old pipes. Barely enough room for one adult at a time. Lena hesitated at the opening. Not because she was afraid of the dark. Because Mercer had spoken to her like he knew her. Nolan saw it. Mercer saw that Nolan saw it. And smiled. "She doesn't belong to Ruiz," Mercer said. Mara went white. No. Not now. Not while the room was collapsing into violence. Not with Nolan one step from the crawl mouth and Rex bleeding from a cut above the eye and Vale half on the floor trying to keep the shield from crushing him. Mercer had chosen that sentence because he knew exactly where to put the blade. Lena made a broken sound in her throat. Mara grabbed her shoulders. "Don't listen." But Lena was already looking at Nolan, not Mara. The kind of look someone gives when a secret they have carried alone too long has just been spoken aloud by the wrong mouth. Mercer fired. Vale took the shot in the side. He folded hard into the doorway, breath leaving him in a raw animal sound. Rex launched again, this time straight for Mercer's throat. Mercer got an arm up just in time. The dog slammed him into the wall, teeth snapping inches from his face, while Mercer's team tried to angle a clean shot and couldn't. "Move!" Vale roared through blood. Nolan shoved Lena toward the crawl. Mara followed. Rex was still on Mercer, buying seconds in chunks of muscle and fury. Nolan moved to grab the dog, then Vale caught his sleeve. Blood was spreading fast across the man's jacket. His mouth was red when he spoke. "Take the girl," he said. "There are 2 girls." Nolan shot back. Vale's face twisted. "Then don't lose both." He slammed his palm down on an emergency lever at the base of the doorframe. Nolan saw the warning light flash too late. A blast bulkhead dropped from the ceiling with terrifying speed. Mara had already crossed into the crawl with Lena. Nolan was half a step behind. Rex tore free of Mercer and lunged back toward Nolan at the same instant the steel barrier came down. Nolan dove. Rex made it through. Mara did not. The bulkhead slammed into the floor between chambers with a deafening iron boom. One side of the room. Then the other. Silence for one beat. Then fists hitting steel from the far side. Mara's voice, muffled and panicked now for the first time. Nolan! Lena turned, saw the sealed door, and screamed. Nolan hit the release controls once, twice, 3 times. Dead. Locked by emergency separation protocol. Mercer's voice came through the steel, calm despite the dog blood on it. Now we negotiate. Nolan backed away from the bulkhead like it had burned him. Behind him the crawl tunnel waited, black and narrow, the only way out. In front of him, sealed on the other side with Mercer and a kill team, was Mara pounding on steel while her sister collapsed to her knees in the runoff water, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. Rex pressed against Nolan's side, shaking, bleeding, still ready. But the truth was already there, ugly and final. They had gotten one witness out. And lost the other. Lena's scream did not stop when the bulkhead sealed. It just changed shape. At first it was panic, raw, immediate, impossible to mistake. Then it became something worse. Recognition. The kind that comes when a person has spent years preparing for the exact moment they would lose the wrong person again, and still collapses when it finally happens. Mara! Her voice tore through the crawl chamber and hit the steel barrier hard enough that Nolan almost felt it vibrate back through his own ribs. On the other side, muffled by inches of reinforced metal, Mara kept pounding with both fists. Mercer's people shouted. Boots scraped. Something heavy slammed once against the barrier from the far side and then stopped. They were reorganizing. That was the part Nolan understood fastest. Mercer had not fired wildly. He had not chased the first available target. He had cut the room in half with one clean move and kept the witness he already knew mattered. Mara on one side, Lena on the other. The split had been tactical, which meant Mercer understood these sisters better than Nolan did. That thought made him feel suddenly late to everything. Rex barked at the barrier, then turned and barked at Nolan. Move. Nolan hated the dog for being right. The crawl tunnel behind them was a narrow black throat cut into the mountain, half full of runoff water and lined with old pipes. No standing room. No turning around once you committed. Just mud, dark, cold, and whatever waited beyond. Lena had backed herself against the opposite wall, hands over her mouth, tears running unchecked while she stared at the steel separating her from her sister. Mara! She cried again. Mercer's voice came through the bulkhead. Calm. Even now. Lena! Listen carefully. She flinched so hard it looked like she had been struck. Do not answer him, Nolan snapped. Mercer continued as if Nolan had not spoken. The man with you cannot get that door open from his side. The manual release is disabled. If you stay where you are, Mara dies in the next 10 minutes. Rex's growl dropped into something almost inaudible. Nolan crossed to the control box beside the bulkhead and tore the faceplate off with his bare hands. Dead panel. Power light gone. Manual crank port locked from Mercer's side. Exactly as the man said. He could not open it from here. Lena saw the answer in his face before he spoke. That nearly broke him worse than the firefight. Nolan forced his voice level. He wants you emotional. Don't give him that. Lena wiped at her face with both hands, but the trembling would not stop. He won't kill her fast. The certainty in the sentence chilled the room. Nolan looked at her. You know that from experience? She gave one tiny nod. He did not ask the next question. Not yet. Because if he asked it now, and she answered now, the tunnel would fill with things he could not carry, and they would both freeze under the weight of them. Mercer's voice returned. Your sister made the wrong choice years ago. Don't make it twice. Lena's eyes shut. Nolan heard it then, the smallest change in her breathing, the shift from panic towards something more dangerous. Submission to pattern. Mercer knew which sentences to use on her because he had used them before. Rex moved first. The dog crossed to Lena, rose on his hind legs, and planted both front paws carefully against her knees. Not rough, not demanding, just present. Present enough to pull her attention out of the steel door and into something living that had crossed time to find her. Lena opened her eyes and looked down at him. Rex whined once. Her breathing hitched. Then, with visible effort, she lowered a shaking hand and buried it in the fur behind his neck. Grounding. The shepherd had done what Nolan couldn't. Mercer heard the silence change and changed tactics immediately. Chief Ward, he called through the door. You're out of moves. Vale is bleeding. Mara is expendable. The girl is not. That made Nolan look up fast. Not because of Mara. Because of Vale. He had almost forgotten the wounded man in the violence of the split. On the far side, through steel and distance, he heard one rough cough and realized Mercer had said Vale's name deliberately. Another blade placed with accuracy. Nolan crouched beside Lena. Listen to me. I need everything you know about this tunnel. She looked at him through tears and fury. For a second, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then the training in her, whatever brutal survival math she had learned down here, won over grief. It goes west, she said. Then it forks. The upper run climbs to the vent shafts. The lower one reaches the drain outlet by the Ridge Creek. Which one do they expect? Both. That answer mattered. Mercer's team had planned this site in layers, which meant every escape route would have a prediction attached to it. The obvious play would be to flee farther into the mountain. The less obvious one was to surface and circle back. That also made it more dangerous, because men like Mercer prepared for cleverness too. Nolan thought fast. Mara trapped. Vale wounded, maybe dying. Mercer in control of the other side of the bulkhead. Lena emotionally compromised every time he spoke. Rex still functional, but bleeding and breathing harder now. And then, there was the line Mercer had dropped just before the door closed. She doesn't belong to Ruiz. It had not been random. It had been chosen to cut Lena open at the exact moment she needed steadiness. Which meant it was either a lie tailored to destabilize her, or a truth too useful not to weaponize. He looked at Lena. What did he mean? Her hand tightened in Rex's fur. No, we don't have time not to. Then ask me after Mara. Nolan almost accepted that. Then the bulkhead gave a new sound. 3 rapid metallic taps from the other side. Not random. Not a struggle. A pattern. Lena went still. Rex's ears flicked. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. 1. Then silence. Nolan looked at her. What was that? She swallowed once. Mara. How do you know? Because that's how we counted when they separated us. The words landed like cold metal. Mara was signaling through the door. Alive. Conscious. Still thinking. And not just signaling, communicating. Lena shifted closer to the steel and answered with her knuckles. 2 taps. Pause. 1. Pause. 2. Nolan didn't understand the code, but he understood the urgency. Mercer would hear it too. He started to stop her, then didn't. Because on the other side of the door, hidden under muffled voices, the pattern continued. Mara tapped again. Longer this time. Fast. Urgent. Lena's face changed as she listened. Not grief now. Shock. What? Nolan demanded. Lena looked at him, and for the first time since he had opened the second room, what he saw in her eyes was not fear. It was decision. She says Mercer is lying about the controls, Lena whispered. There's another way to open the bulkhead. Nolan came up on one knee at once. Where? Lena hesitated. Mercer must have heard enough from the change in sound, because his voice cut in immediately, harsher now. Lena, if you answer that, she dies first. Rex snarled at the steel.
Nolan ignored Mercer.
Where?
Lena's eyes shifted toward the tunnel behind them.
The lower drain fork.
He frowned.
You said that leads to the Ridge Creek. It does.
But there's a maintenance lock chamber halfway there. Manual override wheel on the opposite side of this door.
Nolan stared. Of course. Emergency architecture always had redundant mechanical access for internal flooding or fire separation. Mercer controlled the visible side, but the mountain itself would have demanded a second option.
You can reach it from the drain fork?
Yes.
Why didn't you say that first?
Lena looked away, shame flashing across her face so fast Nolan almost missed it.
Because the last time someone tried that route, only one of us came back.
There it was again. Layers. History. Laws stacked under every practical answer. Mercer struck the bulkhead once with something heavy.
You were running out of time.
The steel boomed. Dust fell from the seam. If he had tools on his side, and Nolan had none on this one, then Mercer was not just waiting. He was either threatening execution to force movement or preparing to open the door on his own terms once the sisters were where he wanted them emotionally. Nolan made the call.
We take the drain fork.
Lena flinched.
If he expects us there, he expects us frozen more.
Rex barked once in sharp agreement. The tunnel behind them narrowed almost immediately after the chamber, forcing them into single file. Nolan took rear position this time, so he could watch both Lena and the bulkhead end as long as the line of sight held. Rex moved ahead of Lena, checking every bend before she reached it, then circling back to nudge her forward if she slowed. 3 times in 20 yards Mercer spoke through hidden speakers Nolan hadn't noticed before. Not shouting. Not threatening. Talking. To Lena. Each sentence built like a trap. You know what happens when you run. You know she can't survive transport twice. You know Daniel lied to both of you.
On the last line, Lena stumbled. Rex turned instantly and shoved his shoulder against her thigh hard enough to keep her upright. Good dog. No, better than that. The dog was doing active combat care on a mind under attack. Nolan stepped in over Mercer's voice.
Ruiz didn't lie to you. He died trying to get you out.
Lena stopped. Slowly, she looked back over her shoulder at him. The tunnel light caught the wet tracks on her face, the exhaustion under her eyes, the scars at her cuff wrist.
How do you know that?
Nolan felt the answer before he gave it.
Because men don't leave recordings to save their own conscience. They do it when they know someone else still has a chance.
The tunnel fork appeared 10 yards later. Upper run, narrow ladder shaft with cold air moving through it. Lower run, wider, darker, water louder. Lena stared at the lower one like it had a memory waiting inside it. Then she whispered,
There's something else you need to know before we go down.
Mercer went silent. That, more than anything, made Nolan pay attention. Lena looked at Rex first, then at Nolan.
When Daniel came back the second time, he didn't come alone.
Nolan felt his pulse slow into something sharp.
What do you mean?
Her next words came out flat, almost detached, as if she had repeated them too many times in her own head to still feel them the same way.
He said he had proof Mercer wasn't the one in charge.
Nolan stared at her.
Who was?
Lena's eyes held as in the dim tunnel. Then she said the name that tore the whole mission open in a completely different direction.
Your father.
The words hit Nolan like a strike to the chest. Your father. For one breathless second the tunnel seemed to tilt around him. The drip of runoff. The pulsing emergency light. Rex's breathing. All of it pulled away behind that single impossible fact. His father had died with medals and a flag case, and a folded reputation no one in town ever questioned. Thomas Ward, decorated engineer, defense consultant, the kind of man who said little, judged hard, and treated pain like weakness with paperwork.
Nolan had spent years resenting him for 100 smaller things. But this? No, Nolan said. Lena didn't flinch from the denial. That made it worse. Daniel found his name on the authorization sheets. Thomas Ward. Site consultant. Structural concealment. Emergency failsafes. Mercer answered to him the first time he came. Nolan stared at her. Behind the bulkhead, Mercer had gone quiet. No taunts. No commands. Just silence. Listening silence. Rex barked once into that silence, then turned sharply away from the sealed door and shoved Nolan's thigh with his shoulder. Hard. Move. Nolan looked down the lower drain tunnel. Darkness. Water. The dull echo of old pumps somewhere deeper in the mountain. Then the whole passage trembled. Not a landslide this time. Not natural settling. A deep mechanical shudder rolled under the concrete, followed by a low metal groan that seemed to travel through the walls themselves. Lena's face drained of color. He started to purge. At once, speakers hidden somewhere in the tunnel hissed alive. Mercer's voice came through calm as ever, but now there was something colder under it. You should not have opened the second room, Chief. Your father always said curiosity makes brave men predictable. Nolan's jaw locked. Rex snarled at the speaker grill set high in the wall, teeth flashing in the red light. Mercer continued. The lower drain route will flood in 90 seconds. The upper vents are already under recovery control. If you're wondering which one gives you the better chance, that depends on whether you want the witness alive or the truth. Then the speakers cut out. Nolan felt the choice closing on him like a trap. Upper route. Maybe survive, maybe lose Mara forever. Lower route. Only chance to reach the maintenance override, only chance to reopen the bulkhead, and now a flooded kill tunnel. Lena had gone very still, eyes on the water creeping faster along the floor. He knows we're taking the lower run, she whispered. Then why make it survivable at all? Nolan shot back. Because he wants to decide where we drown. That was enough. Nolan grabbed her wrist, not hard, just enough to keep her moving, and pointed down the tunnel. You know the path. Rex on me. The shepherd surged ahead at once. They moved fast into the lower conduit, bent nearly double where the ceiling dropped. Water rose from ankle height to shin height in less than 20 yards, rushing colder now, louder now. Old pipes lined the right wall. The left wall was raw concrete sweating mineral stains. Every few seconds another tremor rolled through the floor, loosening grit from the ceiling. Nolan's mind kept trying to split in two. One half tracked angles, pace, air, distance. The other half kept hearing Lena say your father, and replaying every stiff dinner, every careful silence, every unexplained contract trip Thomas Ward used to take when Nolan was a teenager. Rex barked sharply and stopped. Nolan nearly ran into him. The dog stood in the center of the conduit, not looking forward, looking down. A square patch in the floor grating had shifted half an inch under the current. Pressure plate. Nolan's blood ran cold. He yanked Lena back a split second before the grate beneath where she was stepping dipped under her weight. A metallic click answered from somewhere inside the wall. Rex slammed his shoulder into Nolan's leg again, forcing both of them sideways against the pipe run. A charge blew in the opposite wall. Not massive. Not meant to kill outright. A directional blast tore metal and concrete outward across the center of the tunnel, shredding the space where they had been about to step. Shards screamed off the far wall and vanished into the flood. Lena covered her mouth with both hands. Nolan dropped to one knee beside Rex and grabbed the dog's harness. Good dog. Good dog. The shepherd was already barking ahead again. Mercer hadn't just flooded the lower route. He had salted it with old defensive triggers tied into movement and pressure. Which meant the only reason they were still alive was because Rex kept reading the tunnel faster than Nolan could. They pushed on. The conduit widened 30 yards later into a circular lock chamber lined with rusted maintenance ladders and old pump housings. Water thundered through a grated side channel on the far end. Above it, on a narrow catwalk, stood a massive red manual wheel beside a control box sealed behind cloudy plexiglass. The override. Nolan saw the geometry immediately. Too exposed. Too central. Too obvious. And then he saw the bridge leading to it, a narrow metal grate spanning a black sluice shaft where water churned below like moving ink. Lena whispered, "That's the only way across." Rex barked once, furious, and blocked the first step onto the bridge. Nolan stared at the dog. The shepherd's ears were pinned, body broadside again, exactly the way he had stood on the mountain trail before the earth tore away. The same warning. Do not step there. Nolan crouched and swept the flashlight over the bridge. At first, he saw only rust and spray. Then, hairline cuts in the support bolts. Fresh enough that the exposed metal hadn't fully darkened. Someone had half severed the bridge anchors. Not enough to make it fail under casual inspection. Enough to snap the moment a full-grown man committed weight to the center. Mercer had built a drowning lane. Lena saw it when Nolan pointed. Her breath hitched. He wants us desperate. He already is desperate. Rex barked toward the left wall this time, then splashed through the rising water to a narrow service pipe running below the catwalk level. It was barely a route at all, just a maintenance line bolted into the concrete with handholds every few feet. Not safe. Not stable. But real. Nolan almost smiled despite everything. "You found another way." Lena looked at the pipe, then at the black sluice below, and went pale. "I can't." He turned. "What?" She shook her head once too fast. "I can't crawl over open water." Something in the way she said it told him this wasn't general fear. This was history. A rehook snapped through his chest. Mercer didn't just know where to hurt them physically. He knew where memory lived in their bodies. The mountain shuddered again. A siren began winding up somewhere overhead. Water climbed another inch around their boots. Nolan stepped closer and kept his voice level. "Lena, look at me." She tried and failed. Rex solved it before Nolan could. The dog moved in front of her and nudged her hand with his nose, then turned and placed one paw carefully onto the service pipe, looking back at her as if he expected her to follow. Not command. Invitation. Lena's breathing stuttered once. Then, slowly, she put her hand in his fur. Together, step by step, Nolan guiding from behind, Rex leading from ahead, they crossed the service line over the black racing water below. Spray hit them cold and hard. The pipe shivered under their weight. Once Lena slipped and would have gone sideways into the sluice if Rex hadn't braced against her and Nolan hadn't caught the back of her jacket at the same instant. By the time they reached the far catwalk, Nolan's hands were numb. The control box was older than the rest of the room, its seal marked with faded stencil text beneath layers of grime. He wiped it clean with his sleeve. Ward Structural Override /Auth Level TW. For one ugly second, he could only stare. Thomas Ward. Not rumor. Not Lena's memory. Stamped into steel. His father hadn't just known Site 4. He had helped design how it trapped people. Lena saw it too, and looked away like the sight hurt her. "Daniel said if you ever saw that name with your own eyes, you'd stop doubting the wrong people." Nolan wanted to argue. Wanted to reject it. Wanted one more lie. Instead, he ripped the plexiglass panel open with the butt of the pistol. Inside were 3 toggle switches and a manual key slot. No key. He swore under his breath. Rex barked sharply at the control box, then lowered his nose to the runoff pool beneath it and pawed once. Nolan followed the signal, and saw a small metal tab half hidden in the drain channel below the catwalk lip. He reached into the freezing water and pulled up a brass service key tied to red cord. Another trap. Another answer. Another proof someone who knew the system had once planned for a desperate man to get this far. He jammed the key into the slot and turned. Nothing. Then he looked closer. Beside the slot, almost invisible under rust, were tiny etched letters. Pull / then turn his father's kind of design. Instructions hidden in plain sight, only useful if you already distrusted the obvious. He pulled the key outward, then turned again. The chamber came alive. A deep hydraulic thump rolled through the walls. Warning lights shifted from red to amber. Somewhere beyond the bulkhead, ancient gears woke with a grinding shriek. Lena stared at the far wall. "It's opening!" Relief hit Nolan for half a breath. Then alarms changed. Not the chamber. The mountain. A violent horn blasted through the room. Water surged higher all at once. The black sluice below the catwalk frothed white as deeper valves opened somewhere under them. Mercer's voice burst through the speaker again, no longer calm. "You opened the floodgates." Nolan spun toward the grill. "You said the lower route would flood anyway. It was supposed to flood after the witness was still trapped behind the bulkhead." That meant this wasn't just a trap. They had broken sequence. The machinery screamed louder. On the far side of the chamber, a section of wall began to rise, slowly, brutally, revealing the opposite side of the bulkhead corridor inch by inch. A hand appeared first. Then blood-slick fingers clawing under the rising steel. Mara. Alive. Lena gasped her sister's name and moved toward the opening. Rex barked and shoved into her leg so hard she almost fell. Nolan turned just in time to see why. The upper tunnel behind them had split open. Not collapsed. Opened. A black wall of water was coming through it. The water came at them like the mountain had finally decided to erase its own memory. 1 second Nolan was staring at Mara's blood-slick fingers clawing under the rising wall, and the next a black wall of floodwater burst through the upper tunnel behind them with enough force to shake the catwalk. It hit the chamber in a roaring sheet, tore tools from the walls, ripped one of the loose ladders free, and drove cold spray into Nolan's face so hard he couldn't breathe for half a heartbeat. "Lena, down!" he shouted. Rex moved before either of them did. The shepherd slammed into Lena's hip and knocked her flat to the catwalk just as the first surge hit. Nolan dropped with her, one arm over her shoulders, the other hooked around the railing, while water hammered past his knees and exploded into the sluice below. The chamber became thunder, metal, and white spray. Mara screamed from beneath the bulkhead. That cut through everything. Nolan looked up. The wall had risen only chest high before the override jammed. On the far side, Mara was trapped half prone on the floor, one arm shoved under the gap, fingers clawing for space, while torrent water rushed through the widening crack and turned the corridor beyond into a collapsing channel. Mercer's men were shouting over one another in the flooded passage. Someone slipped. Something heavy slammed into the steel. Mercer barked orders, but the mountain no longer cared. "Can you lift it?" Lena shouted. Nolan saw the answer in one glance. Not by hand. Not with the chamber shaking and the catwalk already flexing under flood load. Rex barked at the override column. Nolan turned. The brass key was still in the slot, half twisted, but the control panel had gone from amber to a blinking red fault light. Below it, partly hidden behind the runoff, was a secondary lever recessed under a yellow safety guard. Emergency rise assist. A manual overdrive. "Stay low!" Nolan shouted and lunged. The catwalk shivered under him. Water hit his thighs, nearly swept his feet out from under him, but he made the panel, ripped the yellow guard open, and hauled the lever down with both hands. Nothing. He pulled harder. Metal screamed. The bulkhead jerked up another 4 inches. Mara gasped and shoved herself farther under the gap, but not far enough. Then a hand shot out of the water on the far side and grabbed her ankle. Mercer. Mara's head snapped back with a cry as he dragged her toward the flooded corridor. Lena saw it and lost everything. She came off the catwalk in one motion, running straight into the water toward the rising door, not thinking, not measuring danger, just reacting to her sister being taken again. Nolan swore and went after her, but Rex got there first. The dog hit her sideways with his whole body and drove her into the railing before she could throw herself into the half-open gap.
"Lena!"
Nolan barked. She fought him. Fought Rex. Fought the water.
"He's got her!"
Nolan dropped to one knee beside the gap and saw Mara's face appear in the sheet of spray, panic and fury, and years of survival colliding all at once. Mercer was behind her, one arm around her waist, trying to use the flood to pull her back into the corridor. Even now, he was calculating. Taking the witness. Taking control. Letting the mountain bury whatever remained. Rex snarled. Then the dog did something Nolan never would have ordered and never would have forgotten. He dove headfirst under the half-raised bulkhead into the flood. For one horrifying second, all Nolan saw was Fur vanishing into black water and steel. Then Mercer shouted, a real, shocked shout, not command, and Mara lurched forward. Rex had clamped onto Mercer somewhere below the waterline and yanked.
"Mara! Crawl!"
Nolan roared. She did. She clawed through the gap on elbows and blood-slicked palms, while the bulkhead groaned above her and the whole chamber shook again under another impact somewhere deep in the mountain. Nolan grabbed her wrists and pulled with everything he had. Lena grabbed his belt from behind. Together they dragged Mara through just as the red fault light on the panel flashed solid. The bulkhead started dropping.
"Rex!"
The shepherd exploded out of the gap in a spray of dark water, so hard he nearly took Nolan backward. Mercer's hand appeared for a fraction of a second behind him, reaching, then vanished as the steel slammed down and sealed the corridor with a deafening iron boom. Silence. Not full silence. Water still roared. The chamber still trembled. Lena was sobbing into Mara's shoulder. Rex was coughing out water and blood into the runoff at Nolan's feet. But Mercer was gone. Cut off on the other side of the door or swept somewhere deeper in the flooded system. Nolan didn't know which. And there was no time to care. Mara gripped the front of his jacket, eyes wild.
"He'll know the west drain is gone."
Nolan blinked water out of his eyes.
"What?"
She shoved wet hair from her face and forced air into lungs that still hadn't caught up.
"Mercer sealed the surface outlet this morning. If he thinks we've got the sisters together, he'll expect the ridge exit."
Lena looked up fast.
"Then where?"
Mara turned and pointed not to the flooded tunnel, not to the bulkhead, but upward. Above the catwalk, half hidden by shadow and spray, was a maintenance shaft running vertical into darkness, with ladder rungs bolted into the concrete. Nolan frowned.
"You said the vent lines were under control." "They were,"
Mara said.
"Not that."
Rex barked once at the shaft. Nolan followed the line up and saw something stenciled near the first rung in faded white letters under mineral stains and rust. W3 Escape Riser/AETH Ward. The name hit him harder now. Ward. Again. Every buried layer of this mountain had his father's fingerprints on it. Author control. Structure. Escape. Lena saw him looking.
"Daniel said if everything else failed, Thomas Ward always built himself one way out."
Mara shook her head, still shaking from cold and adrenaline.
"Not for himself."
Nolan looked at her.
"For the people he couldn't save openly,"
she said. The whole chamber seemed to tilt on that sentence. No time to unpack it. The catwalk gave a hard metallic snap from one of its support bolts. Rex growled. Decision made. Nolan got Mara to her feet. She nearly collapsed. Lena caught her before she fell. Together the sisters moved toward the ladder, while Nolan slung the evidence pouch tighter under his jacket and checked the recorder still in his pocket. Still there. Still intact. Ruiz's voice, and whatever was left of truth still riding against his ribs. Rex took the ladder first. Of course he did. The dog climbed awkwardly but with raw determination, forepaws finding rungs, hind legs scrabbling, refusing to wait for human permission while water rose under the catwalk below. Nolan almost laughed at the insanity of it, and would have if his chest had not been too tight to allow it. Lena went next, then Mara. Nolan stayed last, one hand on the rail, looking once more at the sealed bulkhead where Mercer had disappeared. Then the steel on the far side boomed. Not random impact. A deliberate hit. He was still alive. Another boom. Closer. Mercer had found another way toward them, or was simply trying to scare them into moving faster. Either way it worked. Nolan climbed. The riser was narrow, steep, and older than the rest of Site 4. Concrete changed texture 20 feet up, rougher, hand-poured, patched in places. Not military finish. Something more improvised. More personal. Water dripped from above in cold, steady drops. Mara slipped twice and nearly fell. Each time Lena held her. Each time Rex stopped climbing until they moved again. Halfway up, Nolan's shoulder brushed a recessed steel box in the wall. He nearly ignored it. Then he saw the latch. Not military. Not factory. Hand-cut. Worn. He stopped. "Keep moving," Mara called down weakly. Nolan popped the box open one-handed. Inside lay a waterproof envelope wrapped in wax cloth, dry despite the damp shaft around it. On the front, in block letters he had not seen since childhood birthday cards and brutally neat correction notes left on his homework, were 4 words. For Nolan it found his father's handwriting. Nolan stared at it, while cold water ran down his sleeve. Lena had paused above him. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away. Because for one dangerous second he wasn't on a ladder, in a mountain, with drowning chambers below and witnesses above. He was 12, standing in a doorway, while Thomas Ward signed papers at the kitchen table without once looking up, always speaking in clipped, measured sentences, always knowing more than he said, always feeling like a wall Nolan kept bruising himself against. Nolan shoved the envelope inside his jacket unopened and kept climbing. The shaft ended in a slanted hatch hidden beneath a shelf of rock and brush just below the ridgeline. Gray dawn leaked around its edges. Wind forced itself down the seam in sharp cold breaths. Nolan pushed it open, and the morning hit them all at once. Rain, pine, thin light, and air that had not been recycled through concrete and lies. They spilled out onto a narrow shelf above the ravine. For one glorious irrational second, it felt like survival. Then Nolan looked up. 2 black SUVs were parked on the logging road above the ridge. And standing beside the nearer one, rain on his coat, one hand holding a field radio, was a man Nolan knew instantly even though he had not seen him in years. Colonel Matthew Brandt. The same man who signed the official report on Ruiz's death. The same man who had looked Nolan in the eye at the memorial and said, "You did everything you could." Brandt saw the 4 of them emerge from the hidden hatch, and did not look surprised. He only raised the radio, calm as prayer, and said, "Recovery Team 2, they're on the surface." The near-resolution hope inside Nolan died right there. Because the mountain was only 1 layer. And the man waiting above it proved the lie had always reached higher than Mercer. For one heartbeat, Nolan almost believed the mountain had been the enemy. Then he saw Colonel Matthew Brandt standing dry under an umbrella of pine shadows, one hand on a field radio, 2 black SUVs behind him, and armed men fanning out along the logging road like this entire ridge had been waiting to receive what the mountain failed to bury. The truth had always lived above the trap. Rex's growl dropped so low Nolan felt it through the dog's chest when the shepherd pressed against his leg. Mara and Lena stood on either side of the hidden hatch shelf, soaked, shaking, alive, but barely. Dawn had turned the storm from black to gray. That was the cruelest part. Everything was visible now. Brant lifted one gloved hand. "Nolan!" he called, like they were old colleagues crossing paths after years apart. "You've done enough. Bring me the sisters and the archive, and you walk away from whatever your imagination has built." Nolan almost laughed, because the man still thought truth could be reduced to paperwork and tone. He pulled the waterproof envelope from inside his jacket. His father's handwriting stared back at him through rainwater and mud. For Nolan it found Brant saw the envelope, and something finally cracked in his expression. Just a hairline shift. But Nolan caught it. Good. He tore it open. Inside was one folded letter, and one small black transmitter no larger than a lighter. The letter was brief. Of course it was. Thomas Ward had never wasted words when damage could be delivered precisely. If you found the riser, then Daniel failed and Brant reached the surface first. Nolan's throat tightened. I built Site 4. I told myself I was building containment. Then I saw what they were containing. By the time you read this, the worst thing I ever did may still be hidden by the best lie I ever told you. Brant runs glass veil. Mercer enforces it. Aaron tried to bury it, and Daniel tried to break it. I built the West Escape and the uplink relay because some sins should not survive their authors. Nolan read the next line twice. Press the transmitter only when witnesses are in daylight. He looked up. Brant was already moving downhill. Slow. Controlled. Sure, he still owned distance, angles, outcome. I wouldn't do that, Brant said. That was answer enough. Nolan pressed the transmitter. For one dead second, nothing happened. Then somewhere above the ridge line, hidden in rock or brush or a place only Thomas Ward would think to bury salvation, a relay antenna snapped awake. A sharp electronic chirp cut through the rain. Brant stopped, so suddenly one of his own men nearly walked into him. No more bluffing now. He snatched the radio to his mouth. Kill the signal! Too late. The black transmitter in Nolan's hand flashed once, then steady green. Mara stared at it. What did he do? Nolan looked at the letter again. The uplink duplicates everything in the archive to the Inspector General Deadrop and state emergency servers. If Brant is close enough to see this happen, he is close enough to become dangerous. Save the living first. Let the truth do the killing. Something hot and painful moved through Nolan's chest then. His father had built the cage. That would never wash clean. But he had also built the door. Brant saw the understanding in Nolan's face and dropped the mask completely. No more recovery, he snapped to the men on the ridge. Take the witnesses now. The first shot cracked from the road. Rex hit Nolan in the ribs before the bullet reached where his chest had been. Nolan slammed sideways into the wet stone shelf, dragged Mara down with one arm, and felt the round tear bark off the pine trunk behind them. Lena dropped flat on instinct, years of captivity suddenly turning into survival at the exact second it needed to. Go! Nolan shouted. Tree line! They moved. Not cleanly. Not heroically. In wet, desperate bursts. Mara grabbed Lena's hand. Rex ran tight against their knees, then spun back every 3 steps to make sure Nolan was still moving. Brant's team fired in control pairs, trying not to kill the sisters outright, but no longer pretending restraint mattered much. Round slapped rock. Needles exploded off branches. Mud kicked high. Nolan fell behind deliberately. He had one job now: make the ridge care about him more than the witnesses. He put 3 fast shots toward the logging road. One of Brant's men dropped behind an SUV door. Another cursed and lost angle. Brant himself stayed low and kept moving, furious now, not because the sisters had escaped the mountain, but because the truth had escaped him. "Nolan!" he shouted over the gunfire. "You think a file ends this?" "No," Nolan shouted back, backing toward the pines. "The witness is due." That was the right thing to say. Brant changed direction immediately and went for the sisters. Rex saw it before Nolan did. The shepherd broke off from Mara and Lena and launched uphill at a full run. He hit Brant high in the thigh and drove him sideways into the ditch bordering the logging road. Brant fired once, into the mud. Missed. Rex came again, all teeth and momentum in pure refusal to let the wrong men reach the wrong people. Good dog. No, better than that. The best man on the mountain had 4 legs. Nolan reached them in time to see Brant rip a backup pistol from an ankle holster while Rex clamped onto his forearm. The colonel screamed, finally sounding human. Nolan kicked the gun free and drove Brant flat into the roadside gravel with a shoulder across his throat. It would have ended there. It should have. Then Mercer came out of the trees. Wounded. Soaked. One side of his face cut open from somewhere below. But alive, and with a rifle. He had found another exit. Mara saw him first and froze. Lena did not. She stepped in front of her sister without thinking. Mercer leveled the rifle. Everything compressed into one terrible narrow line. Nolan was too far. Rex was still on Brant. The sisters were exposed. Then Mercer looked at Brant. Not at Nolan. Not at the women. At Brant pinned in the mud beneath Nolan's arm, transmitter light still blinking green in the distance above the ridge, the whole operation already bleeding into daylight. Mercer understood. Brant would burn everyone if he could. Mercer included. Brant saw it too. "Aaron!" Mercer fired. Not at the sisters. At Brant. The round hit high in the chest and punched the breath out of him in a shocked, ugly gasp. Nolan jerked back on instinct. Brant stared at Mercer like betrayal was the one thing he still believed rank should prevent. Mercer lowered the rifle a fraction. "You said there would always be another sight," he said. Brant tried to speak. Blood came instead. Then he was done. The road went silent except for rain and hard breathing. Mercer looked at Nolan next. For a second Nolan thought he would have to shoot him too. Then Mercer dropped the rifle. Just let it fall into the mud. He looked past Nolan to Mara and Lena, and whatever lived in his face then wasn't mercy or repentance. It was simply the expression of a man who had spent too long inside the wrong machine and finally realized it was collapsing with him in it. "It was never supposed to last this long," he said. No one answered. Sirens rose in the distance. Not one. Not local. Many. State units. Federal oversight maybe. Emergency response climbing the ridge fast now that the uplink had screamed Site 4 into systems too wide to quietly erase. Mercer heard them and almost smiled, but not with happiness. With exhaustion. Then he sank to one knee in the mud and stayed there. No last stand. No speech. No sudden redemption. Just a man out of places to run. By full daylight, the ridge was crowded with flashing vehicles, tactical teams, medics, and the kind of official panic that happens when buried programs claw their way into the open. Brant was dead. Mercer was taken alive. The mountain below was sealed and marked.